we're going to be able to find and mainly interpret at least squared lines. Now, another name that least squares line have is the line of best fit. Okay, now for the nodes, I'm giving you guys this big table. So it says the following table, it is used for making the preliminary computations for finding the least squared lines for the given pairs of x and y values. So I'm giving you a big table here. Notice how on the left, the first column, I'm calling it xi, which basically means the first number is my x1, my x2, my x3, my x4, basically my values of my x's. So I call it xi to represent all the possible x's. And then you guys see in the second column, I do the yi. And again, this will be y1, y2, y3, y4, 5, 6, and 7. So it is just a basically representation of the y's. For your homework, the only information I'm gonna give you is the x's and the y. So that's what you're gonna see. I have here for the notes a bigger table, but for us to understand it, the third column, it says xi, so the columns of the i's squared. So xi squared. Okay, so what does that mean? I'm looking for the column x. So I'm looking at the first column and I'm going to square each of those numbers. So my column here will be 64, 64, 81, 4, 49, 36, and 100. Okay, so all I did was I saw the numbers in X and I squared each number. Now for my fourth column, I see that I have X, I, Y, I. So basically, I'm going to look at the columns of X and I'm going to multiply them with the column of Y. So I'm going to multiply the values of X and Y. So my first number would be 64 because all I did, I went 8 times 8. So that's how I got 64. My next number is going to be 56 because I'm going to go 8 times 7, right? I'm multiplying the values of X times the values of Y. So to complete this, it will be 63, 6, 21, 30, and 50. Now for this assignment, but I could have added another column here, which I could have called the yi square. So basically, I could have looked at the values of y, square the numbers. I'm not going to use it for today, but we will use it in the future, okay? So later on, I'm going to add the yi squared. So I don't need it for today, but I will use it in the future. Again, just as a little reminder, on your homework, I'm only going to give you the column of X and Y. Like I said, the rest you guys can do. Now, notice how at the bottom, I have this row right here. And it has that E looking thing. Now, that's the Greek letter for, we call it sigma. This thing that looks like an E. I'm going to write it here on the right. This thing that looks like an E, it's a Greek letter that we call sigma. Now, sigma basically means the sum of. We're adding. So notice how here on the first one, I have sigma. I'm looking at here on the left, sigma of xi. Basically, add your columns, add the values in your column X. So I'm just going to add them all. So 8 plus 8 plus 9 plus 2 plus 7 plus 6 plus 10. When I add all of my numbers will be 50. My sigma of yi, so basically add all the values on the column y, add them all, I'm going to get 38. My sigma of xi squared, add all of your numbers, and it's going to be 398. My sigma of xy, if I add all my numbers, will be 290. Once in the future, once I do yi squared, I can ask you for the sigma of yi squared, right? And then we can add them all. Like I said, I'm not going to use that column today, but we will use it in the future. So once it comes in the future, I would make reference of this table, and that would be, remember we talked about this before. Okay, now I do expect you guys to do this by hand. No, we're actually going to use Excel. Okay, we have used Excel before, so I'm going to use Excel. That's going to be our tool for today. So let me open an Excel window here. And let me start here. You guys see my window. Let me start labeling them. I'm gonna go, this was my X, this is my Y. So I'm gonna leave a space. So this is, I'm gonna call it X2 for X squared. This is my XY. So I remember. So notice how here on the first row, on row 1, I labeled things. So let me fill in the information. Information that we had for X were 8. So I'm just gonna fill in the values that we were given. So 8, 8, 9, 2, 7, 6, and 10. For my values of Y, the values were 8, 7, 7, 3, 3, 5, 5. This is basically all I need. That's why on your homework, that's all I'm gonna give you. And then remember, I went X squared, so I'm just gonna go equals. Remember, when I'm gonna have Excel use as a calculator, I'm gonna go equals, and I'm gonna click on the column that has the X, and then I go times. For times, we use the little star. It's usually by the 8, and then I click on the column again. So here I know it says A2, but you guys see the box A2. So I have A2 times A2, which is basically 8 times 8. I press enter, and it tells me 64. Then I'm gonna click here at the bottom right, and I'm just gonna drag it. So it squared each of my column X. Because I told them the first thing to square, it follows through. If I click on one of them, let's say this one, I randomly click, it tells me it's multiplying that. So that's great. Now here on the XY, so I'm gonna go equals, and I'm gonna go the value of X times the value of Y. Press equal, and then I'm gonna drag it here at the bottom. So remember, this is the table that we had earlier, which is good. Now, but I also had the sigma. Remember, I added things, so I'm gonna put it here. I'm gonna leave a space. I'm gonna leave the row 9 empty. I'm gonna start at the row 10. So I'm gonna go equals. Now, what I want, remember sigma, I said you add the number. So I really wanna add, I wanna do a sum. So I'm gonna do equals sum, open parentheses, because I have to tell it what to add. So I'm gonna click on the top and then drag. I'm still clicking. I'm left clicking. I'm not letting it go, just so I can highlight. See how I'm highlighting all the numbers that I want added? I let it go, close my parentheses, and press enter. So it added all my numbers. So I'm just gonna go here. I'm gonna drag this. This one in the middle, I'm gonna erase it because I don't need it. So notice how what it did. Let me click on this one right here. So just to show you, it did the sum, and it's telling me what it's adding. So good, that's what I wanted. So remember the table that we just created earlier? Sigma x, sigma y, sigma x squared, xi squared, sigma xi yi. So I have these. Cool. These numbers I am going to be using. Now, when I look at our homework, let me come back to our notes. When I scroll down, I'm going to be able to find all this information. Okay. Now I'm going to find the sum of the squares of xy. I'm going to find the sum of the squares of xx. I'm going to find my beta 1. I'm going to find my x hat, y hat, beta 0, and then find the least squares lines. I know it looks like pretty scary right now. It looks pretty scary, but it is not. So let me come back to my Excel. I like to label things. I like to label things. So I'm gonna go here. I'm gonna get my answers here at the bottom. First thing we have to do is the sum of the squares. I'm gonna do capital SS and then lowercase xy. The sum of the squares of xy. The funny thing is that once I press enter, it made one of my s's lowercase because it's correcting me. It thinks that I misspell it. It says in English, we usually, when we write a word, we only capitalize the first word. So let me go back to that thing and let me type it how I want it. I'm gonna go SSXY and I press enter. So basically I told Excel, don't correct it. That's how I want it, SSXY. I know I'm gonna find that sum of the squares of XX. My beta one, let me just write it as B1. Then I have to do X hat, Y hat. So I'm just gonna do, some people call it X bar. And let me here at the side, let me do Y bar. I'll explain the meaning of these later. And then I had to find my beta 0, that B looking figure that's called beta. So I had to find my beta 0. And then I have to find the least squares line. And then most of my numbers, my first two numbers, I have to run it to 2 decimal places. And then the rest of my numbers, I have to run it to 4 decimal places. Okay, not bad. Now, let me come back to our notes. I'm going to give you guys the formulas that we are going to be using. Okay, for my sum of the squares of x, y, the way I'm going to find this, I'm going to go sigma of x times y. So I call it sigma xi yi. Now, that's how I'm going to start. Minus. Now, you guys might be, oh, I see x, y, so I use x, y. Yeah, if I had XX, I would have done XX. Okay, cool. So this is how I start this. Like I said, right now, it's the same formula. So the sigma of x times y minus sigma of x times sigma of y. You guys see where I got the x and the y, where it come from, divided by n. N is how many numbers do I have on each list. My lists are going to be the same length, okay? And that will be our formula. And then this is going to give me a numbered. The good thing is I'm going to have Excel figure it out, okay? I'm just giving the formulas for right now. For my sum of the squares of XX, I'm just going to go sigma. Now I could write x. However, on our notes, I call that xi square. So you guys have that value for xi squared, basically x times x, minus the sigma of x times the sigma of x divided by n. It's pretty similar to the previous example. Now my beta 1 is going to be the sum of the squares of xy divided by the sum of the squares of xx. Okay, so like I said, I'm giving the formulas right now. We'll work on those later. We're gonna work the values later. Now, x bar is basically the average of the x's. Okay, so the way I'm gonna figure this out is gonna be, I'm gonna add all my x's and then divide it by how many there are. That's gonna give me my x bar, which is the average of the x's. The average of the y, or the y bar, I'm gonna add the y's divided by how many there are, so n. Now my beta 0, is going to be my y bar, my average of the y's, minus my beta 1 times my x crossbar, x bar, okay? And then I'm going to use the values for the find the least squares line. Okay, let's see. I'm going to use Excel for these. So let me come back here. So SSXY. This is a reminder what our formula look like. I'm going to write my formula here at the side. I remember this was sigma of x, y minus sigma of x times sigma of y divided by n. So you guys can see my screen there. Okay. So I'm gonna go here. And I'm gonna press equal because I want Excel to do all the work. Okay, sigma of x, y. Now you see why I label here in the top. Here's x, here's y, x squared, xy. Okay, so sigma of xy is basically this number, 290. I clicked on it. Minus. Now the fraction, I don't need to write it. I don't need to write it that complicated. I just need to tell Excel that it is a division. So what I'm going to do, I see I have multiplication on the top. I have two values that I multiplied and then I divided by n. So I'm literally going to write it like that. So sigma x, that is this number, 50, times sigma y. So looking at the y's, the adding of the y, divided by, so I do backslash n. N is basically how many values was I given on each row. And there's 7. We can count them. So I'm just going to write 7. And I'm going to press enter. And I'm going to get my sum of the squares xy is going to be 18.57143. My notes or my instruction says rounded to 2 decimal places. So 18.57. Okay, so let me come back here. Good, I have my first value, 18.57. Now my sum of the squares of xx. Okay, let me come back to Excel. Now my formula, I gave you guys a formula earlier. So my formula, just for me remembered, is the sum of xi squared minus sigma x times sigma x divided by n. Okay, so let me go here. I'm going to press equal sigma of x squared, right? So I see x squared here. So sigma is this one. So basically when I added all my values, minus sigma of x is this 50 times sigma of x again divided by 7. Remember, the 7 is because there's 7 values on each column. So my n equals 7. Good, I press entered. 40.85714. I have to round it to 2 decimal places. I'm going to call this 40.86. So good, I have this second value, 40.86. Not bad, not hard. Now here for my beta 1, the sum of the squares of xy divided by the sum of the squares of xx. Good. So let me come back to Excel. Let me remind you of my formula for my beta 1. I have to go the sum of the squares of x, y divided by the sum of the squares of x, x. And I have those values here. So I'm going to press equal, and then this number divided by this number. Press enter. So for this to calculate it, 0.4545. Because now this one, I'm going to round it to 4 decimal places. So 0.4545. Okay. So my beta 1 is 0.4545. Now I have to find my x bar, y bar. So the average of the x's, the average of the y's, rounded to 4 decimal places. Okay. So let me come back to my formula here. For my x bar, let me remind you of the formula that I said we were going to use. For the average of the x's, well, I'm going to add all the x's divided by n. N is how many values we have. Now for my y bar, I'm going to add all the y's. So sigma, remembers add them all, divided by n. N again is how many values we have. Okay. So I'm going to press equal. I see my x, the adding of the x's right here is 50 divided by 7 because there's 7 values. So it gives me, to round it to 4 decimal places, I will call that 7.1429. Okay, that's not bad. For my y bar, I'm going to go equals, add all the y's, divided by 7 because there's 7 values. Press equal. Rounded to 4 decimal places, I want to call that 5.4286. Good. So let me come back to my notes here again. I have values here now. My x bar, the average of the x's, is 7.1429. The y bar, basically the average of the y's, is 5.4286. Now let me come back to Excel. I have B0. And let me remind you of the formula that I said I was going to use. For the formula of B0, I told you guys the formula in our notes. It was going to be y bar minus my beta 1 times my x bar. Right? That's what I told you I was going to use. So let me come back here. I'm going to go equals my y bar. I have it here. That's why I label here. So y bar minus my beta 1 is here times x bar. Press equal. Rounded to 4 decimal places. I'm going to call that 2.1818. Okay. 2.1818. Now, be careful. Be careful. If you use your calculator, make sure not to round. I have Excel so far. I haven't finished my question, by the way, but so far I had Excel do all this because I don't want to be rounding, not until the end. Excel doesn't round until the end, so that's why I've been using that. Now, for my least squares line, I need to know my values of beta 0 and beta 1. Remember when we did this equation earlier? Beta 0 and beta 1. I know my values of beta 0. Rounded to 4 decimal places, my values of beta 0 are 2.1818. And I know my beta 1, it was 0.4545. Remember, we found that up here. You guys see it up here? My beta 1, my beta 0. So for your homework, I'm gonna have, well, let me write the equation. For the least squares line, the equation, I'm gonna be writing y hat is equal to 2.1818, because I'm gonna do my beta 0 plus 0.4545. We'd sometimes put it inside parentheses and then times x. Now this is the formula. Now for your homework, I'm gonna have some of it typed. I'm gonna highlight the numbers that you're gonna have to fill in. So once you know your beta 0, once you know your beta 1, you can finish it off. Like I said, part of it is already typed, because I didn't want to be bothering on you guys typing y hat. How do you type that? Just I gave it to you. So there's going to be 2 spaces, basically fill in the numbers. Now for your homework, yes, I'm going to have you to complete all of these. Again, I'm only going to give you the X and the Y column, but I expect you to complete all of it. Now, for quizzes and tests, I'm thinking I'm just going to give you the table, your X and the Y values. In order for me to know that you did all that, all I just have to do is basically check the equation at the end. So for homework, you do have to find all these values. For the quiz and test, just expect the equation at the end. But obviously, to find the equation at the end, you will have to find all these values before. Now, let me flip the page. Let me flip the page and let me take a look at our next question here. The data from a study of ants in a country are represented or are presented in the accompanying table. The researchers recorded data on annual rainfall, maximum daily temperature, and number of ant species at each 11 study sites. Okay, so there were 11 sites, so my n is equal to 11. And we have what type of region it was. Then they measured how much rain in millimeters, how much rain they got in a year. Then they also measured on each of those 11 sites, they measure what's the maximum daily temperature in Celsius. Okay, now some of you might be wondering, oh man, what's that in Fahrenheit? A rough estimate, the Celsius, double it and add 30. That's how you're gonna find out what's the average maximum daily temperature. And then at the end, number of ant species. So there were some species of ants that came out, how many were recorded. So we have a lot of information there. Now here, consider the straight line model relating annual rainfall and maximum daily temperature X. Give the least squares prediction equation, and we're going to round this to 2 decimal places as needed. So I want you to look at this information, and you guys are going to look for your y value is your rainfall. So these are your y values. And your x value is going to be the temperature. So this is the data we're going to use. The temperature is going to be my x value. Okay, so let me open Excel. Let me come back to Excel here. We can do all of this to find the equation of the line. However, I want you to be able to use technology. So let me erase this. So let me just move here to the side. And I'm gonna write my values. So I have an X and a Y column. So I'm gonna have my values of X. So then let me copy. I remembered I said my X value were the temperature. So let me just copy the temperature. That's information that I need. So 5.9, 5.5. Like I said, I'm just my X value, my temperature. 7.5, 8.8, 9.4, 9.8, 10.4, 10.6, 12.1, 10.9, and 10.9. These values I got them from our data, from our notes, right? Just to show you, these are the values that I use. Okay, for my Y values, I have to use rainfall, right? Okay, so let me come back to Excel. For my Y values, like I said, I like to label things on top so it helps me. For my Y values, rainfall, so I'm gonna go 196, 199, 183, 192, 152, 115, 122, 94, 120, 82, and 121. Like I said, we could do all the steps. We could find the sum of the squares of x, y. We could find the sum of the squares of x, x. We could find all the things that we found on the previous example. However, I want you to start using technology as well. So I'm going to teach you guys how to use technology. Excel is a great tool. What I'm going to do, let me highlight all my points, all my values of x and y. So okay, so I had a technical difficulty. So here, I have my data, right? I had my X to be my temperature and my Y to be my rainfall. And then I copy it. I copy this here in Excel. Okay, so here I had copied my values. Then I'm going to highlight them. So all I did to highlight them, I click on one. On my mouse, I went left click. I highlight all my numbers. Excel knows that the row at the left is my X value and the row at the Y is my Y value. Notice I didn't highlight X and Y. The X and Y were for me to know. Okay, now here I'm gonna go insert and it gives me a choice here. It looks like dots here. I'm gonna click on that. And then I do want it as just the dots there. Boom. I have my data. It graphed all my data. If you notice there's one point right here, which is 5.5, 199. That is my second point. It plotted all my data. I remember back in algebra when we learned how to plot points, they came in as a line. All my points represented a line. That was back in algebra, right? That's when we learned how to write the equation of a line. Now we know what we call the line of best fit, or sometimes people call it the some people call it line of best fit. Some people call it the least squares line. Okay, so how you want to call it, it's up to you. Now, I would like to draw a line. I would like to draw a line that represents my data here. Now, I want to be able to draw a line such that half of my data is in one side of the line and the other data is on my other side. So I'm going to go here on my plus side. And I'm going to tell it to do a trend line. I'm going to click on it. So it says, so the trend line is if I was able to plot my points as a line, that is the line that represents my data. Half of my data is on one side of the line, the other half is on the other side. You might be wondering, well, I only see 5 points on one side and 6 points on the other. That's the best we could do, right? Half on one side, half on the other. So that's the line. That's the line that represents my data. But my homework is asking me to write the equation. Again, I'm asking you guys to use Excel. So I'm gonna go here on my trend line. See, I'm still here on my trend line. Here on the arrow. So you guys see where the arrow is. I click on it. And I'm gonna go under more options. So it's gonna give me choices here. Sometimes when you guys graph it, sometimes it might look like the data, like information like this. Make sure you guys come over to this bar thing. So I want my data to be linear because I want to do a linear. And then here at the bottom, you guys see display equation on chart. Boom. Let me drag this because it gave me my information there. Let me drag it up here to up here. It gives me my equation. So that's the data I'm going to use. Now, funny thing, let me show you guys something else right here. You don't need it, at least not now. But here under more options, display the R-square value on the chart. Okay. Like I said, we don't need it now, but I wanna talk about it. R-square. I can see my data doesn't come as a line, right? It doesn't come as a line. However, I wanna see if a line represents it well. So R squared is basically, I asked Excel, will be how accurate is this line? Give it to me as a percentage, but then it gives it to me as a decimal. So my R squared is going to be a number from 0 to 1. How close is this? So R squared is basically how close is this line represent my data? Like could I consider this line accurate? How confident am I? So it tells me we're about 73.79% accurate. I'm gonna say that's okay. But right now, for the homework for today, I'm not asking how confident you are. I'm just asking to give me the equation of the line. So again, here's the equation. So notice how my first number is the one with the x, and the second number doesn't have the y. I'm gonna use these numbers, okay? I'm gonna round each to 2 decimal places. So my homework, on my notes, that's what it says. So my beta zero is the number that doesn't have an x. So I'm gonna call that 302.93. My beta 1 is a number that comes with the x. I'm gonna call that negative 17.25. I'm gonna round each to 2 decimal places. So let me come back here. So it says give the least squares prediction equation. So I'm gonna write that y hat is equal to my beta 0, the number that doesn't come with an x, rounded to 2 decimal places. I'm gonna call this 302.93 plus, inside parentheses, I'm gonna have a negative 17.25, and then there's an x. For your homework, I'm just gonna ask you for these two values. I'm gonna type in the rest. I'm just gonna ask you for those two values. And you might be wondering, Mr. Leonzo, can I use Excel for the questions that we did before? And I'm gonna say no. I want you to be able to practice both cases. So that's why on the other questions, I ask you to round it to 4 decimal places. Excel is gonna round it to 2. So if Excel rounded to 4 decimal places, I guess you could have done it. But I want you to be able to use it. Okay, let's take a look at my next question here. Now consider a straight line model relating number of ant species. My ant species is going to be my y value to annual rainfall. So the rainfall is going to be my x value, and give the least squares prediction equation. Okay, so let me come back to Excel. Let me move this out of the way. So I'm going to do another one here, my x and my y values. Well, let me use this right here instead. My x and my y values. I'm just going to replace this. This thing works pretty well. My data, you guys will see my data here change, is going to change. Okay, my x values. Remember how for this one, my x value is the rainfall. So for rainfall, I'm going to go 196, 199, 183, 192, 152, 115, 122, 94, 120, 82, and 121. Now, the y value, I'm supposed to use the and species for y. So my values are going to be 3, 53, 7, 7, 5, 53, 4, 4, 4, 5, 4. Okay, I do have an equation. I do have an equation. Now you guys might be wondering why. There's too many points here at the bottom. There's a few points here at the top. Yeah, there I see some data was like way off. But that's how my data got. That's the data that I got. So it gives me this line. It's telling me is about 3.23% accurate. Like I said, I'm not worrying about how accurate it is. More than anything, I want you to know how to use this. So here's my equation. My beta 0 is right here at the end. I'm going to round it to 2 decimal places. I'm going to call that 1.82. My beta 0 is going to be 1.82. My beta 1 is a number with the x. So I'm going to round it to 2 decimal places. I'm going to call that 0.08. So 0.08. Okay. I'm good to answer now. So my equation here is going to be y hat equals, just for us to remember, how do we write this equation is, I'm going to write it up here. Y hat is equal to beta 0 plus beta 1 times x. Okay, beta 1, you should put it inside parentheses. So y hat is going to be 1.82 plus, inside parentheses, I have 0.08 and x. And again, for your homework, I'm going to ask you to just fill in those two numbers.